The medical examiner begins the autopsy of a young woman, but what he sees when he makes the first cut makes him scream and call the police. It was drizzling in Tonala. It was early morning, one of those mornings that seem to never end. The street was empty. All you could hear was the water running through the gutters and falling on the cracked asphalt in the middle of the street, barely lit by a dim, flickering streetlight. There was a body. A girl was lying on her side, her clothes clinging to her body from the rain, her wet hair sticking to her face. She wasn't moving at all, only the rain falling on her without stopping. Several minutes passed until an old car appeared. The engine was faltering, the yellow headlights cutting through the darkness. The vehicle slowed down when it saw the figure lying there. The windshield wipers made noise on the glass. The man inside the car quickly opened the door, got out, stepped onto the wet ground, and ran towards her. He knelt down, getting his pants wet in a puddle. Hey, miss, can you hear me?" He gently shook her shoulder, his voice trembling. "Hello? Wake up. Please wake up." Nothing. Her face remained the same, her lips slightly open. No sound. No reaction. The man looked around desperately. There was no one else there. No houses with lights on. No curious neighbors. Just him, the girl, and the empty street. He swallowed hard and brought his hand to her face, trying to feel if she was breathing. Nothing. He touched her neck as he had seen on TV, looking for signs of life. He found nothing. "Chin, don't do this to me, girl," he whispered, his voice breaking as if he were talking to someone in his family. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. "You need help. Talk to me. Say something." He tried again, his voice broken with distress. The early morning answered him with wet, desperate silence. He ran his hand through his hair, not knowing what to do, then took his cell phone out of his pocket. His fingers slipped in the rain, but he managed to dial. "Hello, ambulance, please. I found a girl lying here on the street. I don't know if she's alive. Please come quickly. It's in Tonala near the plaza. Please come." His voice almost broke as he spoke. He turned to look again at the body kneeling next to her, unable to leave. He just repeated in a low voice like an invented prayer, even though she didn't respond. "Hang on, please. Just until they get here. Hang on." The rain fell harder, washing the street. Time seemed to have stopped in that lonely scene. Minutes later, the ambulance crossed the wet dawn like a lost thunderclap. The siren sounded non-stop, but inside, everything was different. Silence and fear. The paramedic with a serious face and tired eyes kept his hands on the body of the young woman lying on the narrow stretcher. He spoke softly, as if asking her not to give up. "Hold on, girl. Hold on a little longer." At every turn, the vehicle moved. Her body looked more fragile, her face pale, her lips almost the color of the rain that wet the night. Inside the ambulance, the nurse adjusted the tubes of the IV, which were no longer doing anything. She looked at her wristwatch and bit her lip, but didn't say a word. It was as if she already knew what was going to happen. Outside, the city blurred by. Wet facades, lights turned off. Tonala slept, unaware of the desperate race taking place on its streets. When the ambulance made its last turn and the illuminated sign of the Guadalajara Civil Hospital appeared, the paramedic took a deep breath as if releasing a weight. "We're almost there," he murmured, not knowing if anyone could hear him. The vehicle entered through the main door, the tires screeching on the wet floor. The back door flew open and the metallic noise echoed throughout the courtyard. In seconds, they rolled out the stretcher quickly, the wheels shaking. The emergency room was bustling with activity. Stretchers came and went, nurses running hurried voices crossing paths. There was a strong smell of alcohol and disinfectant. Outside, other sirens continued to sound. It was organized chaos, where every second could decide between life and death. The paramedic, drenched in sweat, shouted for them to make way. "Urgency! Emergency! Move, please!" He carried the young woman almost in his arms, the wet sheet stuck to her body. Her breathing was rapid, as if she were carrying not only her own weight, but also the fear of losing her at the last moment. 2 doctors came running, their white coats flying with each step. One of them, with a steady gaze, touched her neck, searching for that small sign of life that everyone wanted. The silence was cruel. He looked at his colleague and shook his head. No pulse. The other doctor pressed his lips together as if he didn't want to accept it. but the hospital environment allowed for no delay. Everything was fast and technical, with no room for emotions. He just lowered his gaze and murmured almost voicelessly, "Confirmed." The hallway was still alive with footsteps, voices, and passing stretchers, but around the young woman, everything felt cold and distant. The paramedic who brought her in was still clutching the edge of the stretcher, his eyes red from exhaustion. He said nothing, just lowered his head and took a deep breath, as if apologizing for not being able to do more. The stamps sounded non-stop on the emergency room reception desk. It was early morning, with doctors coming and going, papers piling up, nurses filling out forms without looking up. Everything fast, cold, automatic. In the midst of this rush, a form was scribbled on. Female, possible overdose. The girl, still wrapped in a white sheet, was left on a stretcher in a corner. The sheet covered her entire body, leaving only her fragile outline visible to those who passed by. It was just another record, another nameless body, another number in the early hours of the morning. A middle-aged nurse with deep, dark circles under her eyes, and a tired voice stopped for a moment beside her, looked at that pale face hidden under the fabric, and murmured, almost like a prayer, "May God receive her." It was the most human thing that place gave her at that moment. Soon 2 employees arrived, pulled the stretcher without saying a word, and began to carry her toward the elevator that was going down to the basement. The wheels made a harsh noise on the waxed floor, echoing down the hallway. The elevator descended slowly, creaking as the doors opened. The smell changed down there. The air was heavier, smelling of formaldehyde and cold. The tiled walls reflected a sad, yellowish light. It was a windowless place where time seemed not to exist. The manager opened a thick notebook full of scribbled notes. She ran her tongue over her fingers to turn the page and wrote without looking, "Early morning stretcher. No identification." She grabbed a bunch of keys hanging on the wall and walked down the narrow hallway lined with metal doors, one next to the other. Each door had a small number painted in black ink. The sound of her footsteps mingled with the low hum of a flickering lamp. She stopped in front of drawer 12, inserted the key, turned it, and the metal door opened with a low groan, giving her goosebumps. Without wasting any time, the employees carefully pulled back the sheet and placed the young woman inside. The cold metal received the body, and in seconds the door closed again with a sharp click, followed by silence. The hallway was empty again, filled only with the smell of formaldehyde and the sound of the flickering lamp. Behind that door, there was nothing but a body forgotten in the darkness. Seconds later, the person in charge of diagnosing the cause of death and performing the autopsy entered. Dr. Luis Miguel opened the door that had just been closed and took the body out, carrying it to the table in the center of the room. The neon lights cast a harsh white light on the steel table where the young woman lay, her body enveloped in a silence that weighed heavier than the atmosphere itself. Dr. Luis Miguel adjusted his glasses, took a deep breath, and took the scalpel out of its case. His movements were trained and steady, but his eyes showed the fatigue of someone who had seen more deaths than he wanted to. He murmured softly, as he always did before beginning, "Let's hurry, so you can rest in peace." A strand of hair fell out of his mask and fell near her face. He didn't even notice. He just brought the blade close to the pale skin, marked by the cold. The silence seemed to hold the air, as if the whole room was waiting for the first cut. Suddenly, something impossible happened. The body shuddered, a slight tremor, but enough for the blade to stop in the air. Luis Miguel opened his eyes in surprise. The scalpel almost fell from his hand. His heart began to beat fast. God! The scream came out uncontrollably, echoing off the cold walls. He took a step back, breathing heavily, his hand still trembling as he held the scalpel in the air, not daring to approach again. His eyes scanned the body, searching for an explanation. Was her chest moving, or was it his imagination? Luis Miguel leaned forward slowly, his gaze fixed. The silence weighed heavier than ever, and suddenly the tremor returned, a minimal but real movement. Luis dropped the scalpel onto the steel floor. The metallic sound thundered in the empty space as if it were a gunshot. He put his hand to his mouth, unable to believe it, and ran to the emergency phone on the wall. His fingers were sweating, but he managed to press the red button. "Police, quick!" His voice came out broken, almost like a cry for help. He stood there, his chest rising and falling irregularly, his eyes fixed on the young woman who must not move. The sound of his own heart was so loud that it seemed to fill the entire room at that moment. The question burned inside him. She was alive. The scalpel was still on the floor, in the same place where it had fallen. The metallic sound seemed to echo inside Luis Miguel's head. He couldn't believe what he had just seen. His hands were sweating. His heart was beating wildly. He took a deep breath, trying to calm down, and took a step forward. He approached the steel table. The young woman's body was still not moving, but something inside him told him it wasn't just his imagination. Luis leaned slowly, bringing his face close to hers. He hesitated for a moment, closed his eyes, and put his ear very close to the young woman's mouth. There was total silence, as if the whole room was holding its breath along with him. For a few seconds, nothing, but then a breath, barely noticeable breath, brushed her skin, a thread of air so soft that it seemed like a hidden miracle. Luis quickly moved away, his eyes wide open. His hand trembled as he touched his chest, as if he needed to confirm that he was still there. Then he brought his ear closer again, this time more firmly, and yes, there it was. A weak, irregular breath, but alive. "You're not dead," he whispered with a broken voice. "Who did this to you, girl?" His eyes filled with tears, but there was no time for emotions. He ran to the table, grabbed a portable monitor, a simple device used for testing, and hurriedly connected the cables, stammering as if trying to convince his hands not to fail. Come on, work, please!" He placed the sensors on her chest. The screen flickered. It took a few seconds that felt like an eternity, and then an irregular line appeared. Heartbeats, but disordered, weak, almost fading away. Luis ran his hand over his face, took a deep breath, and pressed the red emergency button again. "I need help here now. It's urgent. Why are they taking so long?" he shouted, his voice already hoarse. He stood there, holding the young woman's cold hand, not knowing if he was doing the right thing, not knowing if he had time. Every second felt like an eternity. "Hang in there," he said softly, leaning over again. "Don't go. Please. Not now." The tension filled in the air. The irregular line on the monitor flickered, the traces rising and falling without rhythm, as if playing with her life. Luis kept his eyes fixed on the screen and on the young woman's face, torn between science and faith. The metal door of the autopsy room swung open with a creak against the wall. The sharp sound broke the tense silence surrounding Luis and the young woman's body. Hurried footsteps could be heard on the cold floor, firm, heavy, full of authority. It was Lieutenant Valeria Cruz, her face serious, her hair tied back hastily, her gun still in its holster. It seemed as if she had crossed the entire hospital without stopping even to breathe. "What's going on, doctor?" Her voice was firm, but had a tone of urgency, almost a poorly concealed fright. Luis raised his still pale face, sweat running down his forehead, and pointed to the table with a trembling hand, as if it were difficult for him to even speak. "She was admitted as a cadaver," he said, swallowing hard. "She's not." Valeria frowned, approaching her. Her gaze swept over the young woman's body, her chest rising and falling slowly, the traces of life hidden in the silence of the room. She took a deep breath, surprised, but showed no emotion other than an even harder look. "She's alive?" she asked, almost in a whisper, without taking her eyes off the girl. Luis just nodded, trying to catch his breath. Valeria leaned in closer, and that's when she noticed it. On the young woman's wrist were deep red, almost purple marks. They weren't from a fall, they weren't from an accident, they were marks from restraints, clear as screams. She touched them carefully, gently, and whispered to herself, "Tied up." Her eyes rose and met Luis's. It was no longer just a medical case, it was something bigger. Valeria then looked at the young woman's hand. Her little finger was twisted, broken carelessly, poorly healed. She pressed her lips together, her expression hardening. "This is not an accident," she said firmly. Luis ran his hand over his mask as if trying to understand it all. He was torn between relief at knowing she was alive and horror at the evidence that was beginning to appear. Valeria took a step back, her eyes still fixed on the young woman, and took a deep breath. The silence between them weighed heavily, as if it were tons. The question was there, clear, painful, burning like fire in that frozen room. Who had done this to her? The silence in the room was broken by something impossible. A slight, almost invisible movement. The young woman's lips parted slightly, as if searching for hidden strength. Luis leaned forward, unable to believe what he was seeing, his eyes fixed on that motionless face. Then it came, weak, drawn out like a broken sigh. "Don't open me." The voice was almost a whisper, but it was enough to freeze his blood. Luis stood paralyzed, his heart racing and his eyes wide open. Valeria, standing next to him, instinctively reached for her gun holster, as if it were a threat, but she soon realized that no, this was not the voice of danger. It was a plea. It was fear. Luis took a deep breath, his hand trembling as he pulled the sheet back slightly from the young woman's shoulder. He wanted to understand. He needed to see better. That's when he noticed something strange. The skin had a recent, poorly done scar, as if someone had stitched it carelessly, and coming out of it was a rough blue thread that didn't belong to her body. "My God," he murmured, almost voicelessly, touching the area gently with his fingertips. At that moment, the young woman shuddered in pain, her face contorted, although she remained unconscious. Luis quickly backed away, his chest tight. "Calm down. It's over," he whispered, trying to calm her, although he knew she might not hear him well. Valeria approached, watching with attentive eyes. The blue thread seemed to hide something under the skin. It was not a simple wound. The air in the room became even heavier. The cold no longer came from the air conditioning, but from the feeling that was growing between them. What could someone have hidden inside that young woman? And why was one of her hands clenched shut? Luis carefully separated her fingers, and then saw it between her clenched palms. There was a small rosary. It was old and worn, the beads yellowed by time. One of the beads, the one that should have been smooth, was broken in half, and every time she moved a little, a soft sound could be heard, almost like a muted rattle coming from inside. Something was hidden there. Luis ran his fingers over the object carefully, feeling the marks of use. It was the kind of thing you don't let go of, that stays with you your whole life. He squeezed it gently and heard the sound again, confirming that there was something stored inside. Valeria, who was watching closely, frowned, leaned in closer, and murmured in a low but firm tone, "This smells like a trafficking ring." Luis looked up at her, not quite understanding. "A ring?" Valeria sighed, crossed her arms, and shook her head seriously. "No one hides something in a broken rosary for no reason. This isn't faith, it's a sign." Luis, the doctor, remained silent. The weight of those words echoed inside him. He looked at the rosary and saw a symbol of faith and hope. But for Valeria, it was something else. A clue, a warning. Luis closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to balance science with this new layer of mystery. The faint sound coming from inside the broken bead grew louder with each passing second, as if it wanted to shout out a hidden secret. Luis adjusted his glasses with trembling hands. His face still showed the shock of everything he had seen so far, but something else was troubling him even more. He placed the stethoscope on the young woman's chest. The air in the room seemed to stand still. Silence. Only the cold of the walls and the distant sound of movement in the hallway. Luis frowned and moved the stethoscope slowly down her abdomen. He closed his eyes, searching for some sign. Suddenly, a faint, irregular sound vibrated in his ears. The young woman's heart breathed a sigh of relief. He almost let out a nervous laugh, but before he could move the device away, something unexpected made him freeze. Another heartbeat, different. A separate rhythm, small and delicate, hidden inside her. Luis looked away from the stethoscope and gazed at the young woman's still belly. Tears came without warning, and his voice came out broken, a whisper full of surprise and tenderness. "There are 2 heartbeats." Valeria, who was standing next to him, turned around suddenly. "What are you saying?" Luis couldn't answer right away. He ran his hand over his wet face, took a deep breath, and with a lump in his throat, he simply repeated, "She's pregnant, and she's alive." The weight of the revelation fell on them both like a silent thunderclap in that cold room where only death was expected. There were 2 lives. Luis moved closer, leaned over the young woman, and whispered softly as if speaking a secret, "Don't worry, little one, you're not alone." At that moment, her body moved slightly, and her lips opened with effort. Her voice came out hoarse, almost muffled. "My name is Lucia. Don't let them find me." They were short words, but each one seemed full of pain and fear. Before she could say more, her eyes rolled back, and her body went limp again. Luis grabbed her hand tightly, as if to prevent her from fading away again. Tears continued to fall, as he replied firmly, almost like a promise, "I will never let you go." Luis was still holding Lucia's cold hand when the weight of those words, "Don't let them find me," kept echoing in his head like an impossible-to-silence echo. Her breathing was weak, but she was still there, and that was enough for him to not take his eyes off her for a second. His hand, damp with sweat, slipped into his robe pocket. He was looking for a handkerchief to dry his face, but he found something else, something he had kept for years without having the courage to throw away. It was an old wallet, the leather already worn. He opened it almost without realizing it, and there was a small photo with folded corners, already yellowed by time. In the picture, a girl smiled, her hair in 2 little braids, her eyes alive and full of future. It was Anna. Luis's chest tightened suddenly. A lump rose in his throat so strong that he had to lean on the edge of the table to keep from falling. His eyes filled with tears, but it wasn't just sadness. It was guilt, a heavy, old guilt that he carried every day, like a brick in his heart. "Forgive me, my girl," he whispered, the sound barely coming out. He remembered the day he didn't arrive on time, the phone ringing, the hospital calling, him trapped in a surgery that wouldn't end. By the time he could get there, it was too late. Anna was gone, and since then, every young face, every life that faded away in his hands, it was like reliving the same scene. Luis closed his eyes tightly, the photo trembling between his fingers. The pain wouldn't go away, but there, in front of Lucia, he felt something different. It was as if fate was giving him a chance not to fail again. He looked at Lucia, fragile, with 2 heartbeats of life inside her, and pressed the photo against his chest. "I won't fail again," he said through clenched teeth, his voice wet with tears. He put Anna's photo away again, but now it wasn't a painful memory. It was a promise. He wouldn't let Lucia meet the same end. He wouldn't let those 2 heartbeats fade away. Valeria already had the radio to her shoulder, calling for backup and an ambulance to transport her. Her voice was firm, but there was a tension in the air that couldn't be hidden. Luis, leaning over Lucia, still holding her hand, attentive to every faint sigh that escaped her lips. Suddenly, footsteps echoed in the hallway, quick and heavy. 2 men appeared at the door of the autopsy room. They were wearing gowns, but something about them didn't fit. Their gaze was not that of doctors. It was hard and distrustful. One of them frowned, looking at the scene in front of him, the light on, the medical examiner with a scalpel on the floor, a young woman who was supposed to be dead, now connected to cables, with the police standing beside her. "Who authorized this?" His voice was sharp and serious, like someone who doesn't ask questions but demands answers. Valeria exchanged a quick glance with Luis. There was no time for explanations. She discreetly reached for her gun, but Luis was quicker. With a sharp movement, he turned off the switch, and the room was plunged into darkness, lit only by the faint light of the machines. Now, he shouted in a voice firmer than he'd expected. Valeria didn't hesitate. She ran to the stretcher, helping Luis push it. The wheels squeaked on the floor, but the sound of footsteps behind them was even more threatening. Lucia, now more unconscious than awake, was shaking on the stretcher, her pale face reflecting the dim light. Luis leaned over her, protecting her belly with his body, as if he could stop any danger just with his weight. The 2 of them pushed the stretcher toward the side wall, where there was a rarely used service door. Valeria kicked it hard, and the door opened with a squeak, revealing a narrow, dark hallway behind it. One of the men approached with a firm, annoyed voice. "Stop right there!" Luis felt his blood run cold, but he didn't stop. He was sweating, His heart was pounding, but he had only one thought: I'm not going to lose again. Valeria pushed the stretcher down the narrow hallway, guiding it with one hand and pulling out her gun with the other. The sound of footsteps followed their every move. Luis's breathing was short and desperate, but he still found the strength to lean over and whisper in Lucia's ear, "Hold on, we're getting you out of here." The stretcher shook and banged against the narrow walls, but it kept moving forward. Doors could be heard opening behind them, voices spreading out, and the elevator a few meters away. The old elevator descended noisily, illuminated by a dim lamp that flickered as if it were about to go out at any moment. Luis and Valeria pushed the stretcher hurriedly, both sweaty, breathing deeply, trying not to make too much noise with the wheels on the metal floor. Lucia remained lying down, her face white, her hands clenched tightly as if holding something very valuable. With the sudden movement of the elevator, there was a click. The rosary was still between her fingers, but one of the beads, already broken, came loose, opened completely, and rolled across the metal floor. "Careful," said Luis, bending down quickly to pick it up before it fell through the crack in the door. When he stood up, he realized that the bead was not empty. Inside was a small, transparent wrapper, protected by thin plastic, a microchip. Luis looked at Valeria without understanding. She reached out, took the object carefully, turned it from one side to the other, and her eyes hardened. This is truth, she whispered, almost without moving her lips. The silence between them became heavy. It was no longer just about saving Lucia. Something bigger was hidden there, right in front of them. The elevator doors opened with a metallic clang. The cold air from the basement brought the smell of disinfectant and formaldehyde. Narrow, dimly lit corridors stretched out in all directions. It was a place where no one wanted to be. As they pushed the stretcher forward, a soft voice was heard behind them. "Who's there?" It was a woman wearing a cleaning uniform, a bucket in front of her, and a rag in her hands. She walked slowly, her back hunched, but her eyes alert. When she approached, she saw Lucia on the stretcher, and her face changed. "My daughter," she murmured, her hand trembling over her mouth. Without thinking twice, she took off her old wool sweater and covered Lucia's fragile body. Then, without asking permission, she began to pray in a low voice. They were not rapid words, but notes, a soft, ancient melody coming from the depths of her soul. Luis and Valeria remained silent, just watching this simple and powerful scene. Suddenly, something inexplicable happened. Although she was unconscious, Lucia began to cry. Tears flowed from the corners of her closed eyes, sliding down her pale face. Her body trembled slightly, as if that song had touched something hidden, a memory, a deep wound. Doña Remedio, without realizing it, continued calmly, "My girl, calm down." Luis swallowed, moved, without understanding. Valeria looked on with a raised eyebrow, trying to remain cold, but even she could not avoid the lump in her throat. The narrow basement hallway seemed endless. The lights flickered, the air was heavy, and each step sounded loud, as if announcing their location. Luis pushed the stretcher carefully, while Valeria walked ahead with her gun in hand, her gaze serious, but alert to any shadow. Doña Remedio walked alongside them, rosary in hand, murmuring her prayers. "We can't stay here," she said, Valeria in a low voice, looking around. "This place isn't safe." Luis nodded quickly. His heart was beating fast, but his mind was searching for a place where no one would think to look. Then he saw a half-open wooden door at the end of a hallway. A smell of wax and incense came from there. "The chapel," Valeria murmured. She turned around in surprise. "A chapel? No one would suspect it," he replied, almost in a whisper. "They'll be safe there, at least for a moment." They pushed the stretcher inside. The chapel was small, with lit candles everywhere. The wooden benches were old, and the simple altar had an image of the Virgin Mary surrounded by wilted flowers. The silence there was different, not heavy like in the basement, but soft, almost as if it were embracing them. Luis took a deep breath, feeling something lift from his chest. He knelt next to Lucia, carefully wiping the dried blood staining her shoulder. His fingers trembled, moving slowly as if he were afraid of hurting her more. Doña Remedio began to pray again in a low voice. Her voice mingled with the flickering of the candles, and it seemed as if time had stopped. Luis, who had not prayed since his daughter's death, stared at the image of the Virgin Mary and thought to himself, but he did not finish the sentence. Valeria looked at him out of the corner of her eye, but said nothing. She knew that the silence was very heavy. While cleaning Lucia's shoulder, Luis noticed something strange. The scar that had been quickly stitched up where he had seen the blue thread before was now lighter, as if it were hiding something under the skin. He frowned, moved closer, and touched it with his fingers. "This wasn't an accident," he murmured carefully. He took out a small pair of scissors from the first aid kit and began to cut the ugly stitches. Lucia moved, even though she was still unconscious, and a soft moan escaped from her mouth. Calm down, it's over," Luis repeated, as if singing. When he removed the last stitch, the skin opened slightly and revealed something discolored, almost erased. A poorly hidden tattoo, 2 letters, NN. Luis stood still, staring at those letters. It was like a code, a secret that someone had marked on her body. He looked at Valeria, who raised a serious eyebrow. "What does it mean?" she asked. Luis did not answer because, at that moment, more than ever, he understood that nothing in this young woman's history was by chance. Every mark, every wound had a message. The chapel was completely silent, broken only by the sound of the candles crackling and Lucia's weak breathing. Luis remained kneeling beside her, attentive to every sigh, while Valeria paced back and forth restlessly, her eyes fixed on the microchip she had removed from the rosary. She took a deep breath and took a small, heavy black cell phone out of her pocket, without any common apps, only for research, a secure device that did not use normal networks. "Let's see what this hides," she murmured, almost to herself. Luis looked up, concerned. "It's safe. There's no other way," she replied firmly. With quick hands, she inserted the chip into the cell phone adapter of the cell phone. The screen took a few seconds to recognize it. Time felt slow, each second weighing like lead, until suddenly images appeared. Valeria and Luis leaned in close to the screen, and what they saw made their blood run cold. The video showed a large, damp place with industrial lamps. The walls were peeling, with water stains on the floor and dirty mats arranged as if in a warehouse. Abandoned on top of them were drugged women, some moaning softly, others completely asleep like broken dolls. Luis covered his mouth with his hand in horror. "God, what is this?" Valeria, her jaw clenched, zoomed in on the image. At the back of the wall, painted in red, was a huge symbol, the figure of a snake coiled around itself with yellow glowing eyes. She sighed deeply, clenching her fists. This is no coincidence. Luis couldn't take his eyes off the screen. His heart was beating very fast. His stomach hurt. In every face that appeared in the video, he saw his own daughter lost in the past. Tears came without asking permission, but he tried to hide them by quickly wiping his eyes with his hand. Valeria, noticing his pain, put a hand on his shoulder. Her voice was low but firm, as if she already knew the storm that was coming. "Doctor, we're not talking about one victim. We're talking about many." Luis felt his throat tighten and was unable to say anything. The video camera then moved, and for a second showed a tall figure with its back turned and its hands behind its back. Its face was not visible, only the shadow it cast on the wall in front of the painted snake. Valeria frowned and narrowed her eyes. They are not alone. Someone is directing them. The cell phone screen still glowed with those terrible images when a soft moan broke the silence of the chapel. Luis turned quickly. Lucia's heavy eyes opened just a little, fighting against the tiredness of her body. Luis immediately knelt down beside her. "Calm down. You're safe." But Lucia shook her head slowly, tears falling from the corners of her eyes. Her voice came out broken, as if each word took a lot of effort. "They took my younger sister. I escaped." Luis felt a lump in his throat. Valeria also leaned in, her eyes attentive, taking in every detail without losing the compassion hidden in her gaze. "Your sister, where is she?" she asked calmly. Lucia tried to speak, but her voice failed her. Tears wet her pale face. Luis gently took her hand, running his thumb over her cold skin, trying to give her some strength. Breathe, Lucia. Slowly. Can you tell us? She swallowed hard, her breathing shaky, and finally whispered, "The boss is called the Father." The words hung in the air like a sentence. Valeria exchanged a serious look with Luis. It wasn't just a name. It was the shadow behind the network, the figure that no one wanted to name. Lucia closed her eyes again, exhausted, but the tears kept falling. It was then that Doña Remedio, standing on the corner, approached, placed a wrinkled hand on Lucia's forehead, and began to sing softly. The melody was old, a lullaby that seemed to come from far away. Her voice was simple, but full of affection. At that moment, Lucia's lips moved almost reflexively, and through her tears, she whispered, "My mom sang the same song." Remedio stopped singing suddenly, as if something had surprised her. Her eyes filled with tears, and her hand began to tremble. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice breaking. Lucia, still weak, opened her eyes just a little. "My mother used to sing that song in oblatos." A silence filled with emotion filled the chapel. Doña Remedio brought her hand to her mouth, trying not to cry. "I think I remember. I took care of her when she was a child," she murmured, not believing what she was saying. "Back in the Oblatos neighborhood, your mother asked me for help. I took care of her." The tears no longer only running down Lucia's face, but also down Remedio's. It was as if, at that moment, two distant stories had come together again. Luis watched the scene, unable to hide his emotion. Valeria took a deep breath, struggling to remain steady, but even she couldn't hide the lump in her throat. The candle dripped thick drops of wax, as if time were slowly melting away. Lucia's rosary, still damp from sweat and rain that night, glistened faintly in the flickering light. I picked it up carefully. The beads were worn, some gnawed by time. The cracked bead that had already opened creaked a little when my fingers forced the thin metal of the charm. "Slowly, doctor," Valeria whispered. I took a deep breath and lifted the edge with my fingernail. The charm opened completely. Inside, in addition to the microchip, there was something rolled up inside, a tiny cylinder taped with transparent tape, so delicate that it looked like it would break just by looking at it. "Look," Valeria brought her face closer. "There's something else." She placed the roll on the steel tray. The metal was cold, and the paper trembled in her hand. It was graph paper, the kind with squares, but already a little yellowed. Unrolling it was like pulling on a thread of memory. The lines opened up, revealing a drawing of map made with pencil strokes, simple and rustic, but confident. There was a long street with arrows, a thicker line marking a cut as if it were a bridge or a canal. There were 3 X's in a row, like marks made by someone who couldn't be wrong. In the corner, drawn in blue ink, was a snake with pointed eyes and a thin tongue. It seemed to be watching the paper. "Look at this," I said in a low voice. Valeria picked up the map carefully, without breaking it. Her eyes scanned the lines as if she had walked there many times before she bit her lip, took a breath, and then said without looking up from the paper, "That's on the outskirts on the way to Tonalá." The air in the chapel changed. The candles flickered more strongly as if responding. Doña Remedio, standing a few steps away, pressed the rosary against her chest. I could only hear the beeps of the makeshift monitor and my own breathing. "Are you sure?" I asked, even though I already knew from her face. "I've seen it," Valeria said firmly. "It's the old exit. Warehouses, empty lots. No one looks that way." She folded the paper with the same precision with which one folds a farewell letter and placed it back in his hand. The light square seemed to weigh a ton. He looked at Lucia, her pale face, her wet eyelashes still glistening from her earlier tears. I brought the stethoscope to her belly without saying anything. I placed it there and stayed still, closing my eyes. First her irregular rhythm, weak but stubborn. Then that other sound, smaller, far away, and close at the same time, like 2 little steps in the darkness, 2 heartbeats, 2 lights shining in a windowless room, 4 without a window. The silence of the chapel seemed like a fragile refuge, as if the walls were stopping time for them. But time does not stop forever. When Valeria signaled to leave, Luis adjusted Lucia's stretcher and Doña Remedio slowly opened the side door. The hallway was dark, with only a lamp at the end flickering as if waiting for them. They took 2 steps, which was enough for a nurse who was passing by stopped in the middle of the hallway. His eyes widened when he saw the stretcher, Lucia still alive, the gun in Valeria's hand. The silence lasted a second until he shouted loudly, "Here! Here!" The sound bounced off the walls, the echo running ahead of them. Valeria cursed under her breath, tightening her grip on the gun, and then the light went out with a sharp click. The hallway was plunged into darkness. Only their own footsteps and breathing could be heard. Luis felt his heart racing. Valeria pulled the stretcher hard, looking around from the darkness. Quick footsteps, low voices, the metallic sound of weapons being loaded. 3 armed shadows approached, blocking the way. The cold gleam of metal shone in their hands. The silence lasted a second until the first shot rang out, exploding against the wall. Pieces of plaster fell with the metallic sound. She ran down the narrow hallway like thunder in a cage. Lucia shuddered, unconscious. Without thinking, Luis threw himself on top of her, covering her stomach with his own body. He didn't scream, his voice broken with fear. Valeria fired back. The flash of the gun lit up her serious face for a moment. Another shot ricocheted, the sharp sound hurting Luis's ears. "Stairs!" Valeria screamed, pulling the stretcher with one hand and aiming with the other. They ran as best they could, the stretcher banging against the narrow walls. Each shot sounded behind them like a hammer of death, trying to catch up with them. Luis's legs felt heavy, but he didn't let go of Lucia's body, protecting her belly, taking care of those 2 little heartbeats that only he had felt. When they reached the emergency staircase, Valeria kicked the door and the metal opened with a bang. They stumbled up the stairs, the echo of the shots still following them in the parking lot. The cold early morning air hit them like a punch. The sky, still wet from the rain, reflected the dim lights of the streetlights. Luis ran to the nearest car, an old car he used to drive to the hospital. He opened the door with trembling hands. "Quick, doctor!" Valeria shouted, pushing the stretcher inside. Luis got in and tried to turn the key. The engine roared softly, but failed. He tried again. Nothing. Sweat ran down his forehead. His breathing was rapid and uncontrolled. His hands were shaking so much that he almost dropped the key. It was then that he felt it, a fragile, cold hand touching the back of his neck. It was Lucia, unconscious until recently, now opening her eyes with effort. Her voice came out hoarse and low, but with weight. "Breathe, please." Luis closed his eyes and took a deep breath, as if those words were the only order that mattered. He held his breath and released it slowly. He tightened the key and turned it again. The engine roared, coughed, and finally started. Luis almost cried with relief. Valeria slammed the door shut, the gun still in her hand, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. Doña Remedio, in the back seat, prayed with her rosary pressed to her chest. And there, in the midst of the chaos, a small victory was born. The car shook, but moved forward, and inside it, 3 frightened adults and a wounded young woman clinging to 2 fragile heartbeats believed for a moment that there was still hope. The car stopped in front of the rusty gate, the bodywork vibrating along with the tired engine. The neighbor's dog barked as if tearing through the night, then silence. Only the wind, moving a piece of canvas tied to the wire. "This is it," said Valeria, looking at the folded map and the shadow of the warehouse. Lucia was breathing shallowly, her eyes half closed. Doña Remedio held her hand, the rosary between her fingers. "Stay in the car. Calm down," she said in a low voice. "If anything happens, honk the horn. God bless you," murmured Remedio. Valeria forced the lock with a metal bar. There was a click, and the gate opened with a long groan, as if the metal felt pain. The smell came first, strong ammonia stinging our noses. Inside, it was cold, with a cement floor and dark stains on the walls. A tall lamp flickered, hanging from a twisted cable. The sound of our footsteps echoed along with droplets falling from a pipe. I swallowed hard. The metal beds were lined up, 6 on each side, without mattresses. Only old sheets folded as if no one had been there, as if they had left in 2 minutes. The emptiness made more noise than the people. It smells like fake cleanliness, said Valeria, sniffing the air. They clean what you can see, not what's hidden. I ran my hand over a cold, sticky grate on the floor at the foot of the last bed. I saw something small and bent down. It was a girl's pink hairband with worn glitter on the ends. I trembled. I picked it up carefully. The ribbon smelled of cheap shampoo and someone who had run and sweated. "This is from a little girl," I said with a lump in my throat. Valeria looked serious. She didn't answer. Her eyes scanned everything, looking for exits, hearing things I couldn't hear. We went to the back. There was a corner separated by boards and bricks piled on top, a makeshift altar, boxes making a table, candles stained the wood, overturned plastic cups, scattered gray ash. The drawing of the snake appeared again, ugly, painted behind, the paint dripping like a tongue. When I approached, a small sound began, just a speaker hidden under the box, playing a voice meant to calm. "Sleep, my girl, sleep, everything is fine." My stomach churned. The voice repeated itself like a twisted prayer. Valeria pulled the cable, and the device fell. Everything was quiet again, my heart beating in my ears. "There's something else here," she said, touching the boards of the altar with the tip of her boot. She pushed a board, and the floor sounded hollow. Valeria bent down, pulled a hidden latch, and lifted the wooden cover. Cold air came out of there, rising from the basement. A concrete step appeared, then another, then darkness. "I'll go down," I said without thinking. "Together," she said firmly. We went in. The smell of ammonia grew stronger, burning our throats. The light from my cell phone revealed a short, damp tunnel with paint peeling off the walls. The hallway opened into a small room with a low ceiling, and there, what I didn't want to see, chains attached to the wall, some with padlocks, others loose on the floor, scraping the cement. God, it slipped out without meaning to. There were photos burned in a metal drum. I grabbed one. 2 fingers on the black edge, the center almost completely burned. You could see a piece of a face, just the outline of an eye. Another photo showed an arm with a plastic bracelet like the ones in hospitals. All burned, almost completely destroyed. "They destroyed the evidence," said Valeria, clenching her teeth. In the corner, on a crooked shelf, there was a blue folder covered in dust. Valeria opened it. Inside were stapled sheets, a list with columns for initials, names, dates, ugly, hasty handwriting, as if written by someone who didn't want it to be read. She scanned it until her finger stopped on a line. It trembled a little. "Here," she whispered. "Next to it says Esperanza Navarro." My chest tightened. The name hung heavy in the air. I heard Lucia's voice in my memory. "They took my little sister." The pink ribbon was warm in my hand, as if it were alive. "Esperanza," I said softly, feeling it hurt to say it. Valeria closed the folder slowly, her eyes meeting mine. "The list doesn't lie," she said. "We already have the name." I breathed once, twice. The basement felt smaller, the walls closer. The dripping water in the background became a clock. Silence. "Is she here?" she asked. No one answered. Only the cold on the back of my neck. Only the smell of ammonia. Only the pink ribbon clenched between my fingers, as if it were a little girl's hand asking me not to let go. The wood creaked slowly, a groan that echoed throughout the shed. Luis and Valeria turned at the same time. The door at the back opened a little, then a little more, and a girl with pigtails appeared in the doorway. She was skinny, with a frightened look on her face. Her knees were shaking. Her skin was stained with dirt. She blinked in the light and suddenly saw what she had to see. Lucia's voice came out thin with fear and hope mixed together. Lucia was standing, supported by Luis's arm and Doña Remedio's shoulder. She had insisted on going in even though she was weak. The cold floor of the shed made a dry sound under her feet when she took a step forward. The girl covered her mouth with her hand and ran, her pigtails flying. The hug came with a force that made you feel like you were coming back to life after a long time underwater. They cried loudly, without shame, without hiding, a cry that scraped and cleansed at the same time. "Hope," whispered Lucia, her hand trembling. They clung to each other, as if breathing again after a long time underwater. They cried loudly, without shame, without hiding, a cry that scraped and cleansed at the same time. "Hope," whispered Lucia, her hand trembling between her sister's braids. My girl, I thought you weren't coming," said the little girl, sobbing with her face buried in her sister's neck. Luis stood still, unable to move. Lucia's rosary hit his wrist and made a soft sound. The pink ribbon he had found in the shed was now in his warm hand. He offered it to the girl. She recognized it instantly, pressed it against her chest, and cried even harder. If someone had been recording, the camera would have been on Luis's face, wet with surprise, not knowing when the tears had started to fall. His throat closed up. It was joy and pain at the same time, as if those two things were also sisters. He lifted his face for a second, trying to hold back, but he couldn't. He took a short breath. It hurt, and it was good that it hurt. Valeria stayed to one side, watching, but her eyes were shining. Doña Remedio ran her hand down the backs of the two girls without saying anything, just breathing with them. The shed, which had previously been cold and smelled of ammonia, now had the sound of a family becoming a family again. The crying gradually subsided. The sisters remained close together. Silence slowly returned. It was at that moment that another voice was heard behind them, soft, too calm. How good that Luis and Valeria had come. They turned around. There he was, dressed in dark clothes, his hair combed to the side, his shoes dust-free in a place full of dust, his face calm, his gaze sweet, which hurt. He looked like a teacher, a neighborhood father figure, someone who brings bread to the neighbors. But his eyes said something else. "There's no need for violence," he said, opening his hands as if offering peace. "Everything is in order. She doesn't remember anything." His gaze rested on Lucia, as if he were talking to a little girl. A weak, rehearsed smile. Luis's stomach churned. Valeria stepped forward, her body firm, her hand close to her gun, her jaw set. "No one else come near," she warned without shouting. He ignored her, remaining calm as if he were at mass. "We can talk. You don't understand. The girls are being taken care of." She pointed to Lucia with her fingertips. "She doesn't remember anything anymore." Lucia slowly let go of her sister. Her body swayed, very weak. Luis tried to step forward to hold her, but she stayed put. She took a step forward on her own, her face wet, her hair tied back, her eyes red from crying so much. They lit up in a second that seemed to set the silence on fire. "I do remember the word," she said, and it fell like a stone. His smile remained, but his eyes hardened. Everyone's heartbeat was too loud. Valeria didn't blink. Hope pressed the pink ribbon against her chest, and there, face to face, the sweetness of it all, and the girl who decided not to remain silent, everything became clear. The conversation was not about remembering or not remembering. It was about truth and fear, and now no one was going to speak for her. The air in the shed became heavy, as if even the dust had stopped to watch. The man who called himself the father kept his sweet smile for a few more seconds. Then his expression slowly changed. He reached inside his dark clothes, and when he pulled his hand out, the metallic shine reflected the candlelight, a long knife with a thin blade, too clean for that dirty place. "Don't make this more difficult." His voice came out softly, like a sermon. She couldn't follow. His gaze fell on Lucia, and those who saw it felt their stomachs tighten. Luis's body stiffened, as if an invisible hand were squeezing his chest. Valeria reacted immediately, pulling out her gun and pointing it firmly at the man. "Drop that now," she said in a sharp voice, her finger trembling just a little on the trigger. The man took a step forward without backing down. The smile remained, but the knife flashed menacingly again. "You're not going to shoot," he murmured confidently. "Not in front of the girls." In that instant, everything seemed to happen at once. Lucia's pale face, the dry sweat on her forehead, her hands clutching her sister, her belly where two small, fragile hearts beat. Memories returning, old pain, promises made in the dark. The man advanced. Luis didn't think in words. He reacted with his body, throwing himself forward, using the weight and urgency of the moment. The knife flashed by, grazing his shoulder. The blow was strong. The two fell to the ground. metal clanging against concrete with a sharp sound. The shed fell into a piercing silence. All that could be heard was heavy breathing and bodies dragging themselves through the dust. The knife hit the ground and slid for a moment. The attacker tried to regain control, his knee pressing against Luis's chest, his face close, his smile turning cruel. "You always fail, don't you, doctor?" the man whispered, as if he knew Luis's old mistakes. Anger rose hotly within Luis. He reacted with force, pushing and turning his body, struggling to take the knife away. Her hands grabbed the attacker's arm. The blade was inches from his neck. The effort was great, the fear too, but there was something stronger pushing every movement. Two fragile lives beating, asking for help. In a corner of the shed, the cell phone that Valeria had left recording continued to capture everything. The light from the small monitor flickered, recording every second of the scene. It could be saved on video, proof of everything. Screams came from Luis's body, a sound of fear, courage, and desperation, and the fight turned around. The knife slipped from the man's hand and fell to the floor with a metallic sound. The two lay there, breathing heavily, sweat and dust stuck to their skin, on the cold floor, with dust on their clothes. A certainty burned more than the exhaustion. There, at that moment, two lives were at stake. If Luis failed, it would not be just one person who would be lost. It was not just about saving a young woman. It was about protecting what had not yet been born. The silence that followed weighed like a sentence. For a few seconds, the world held its breath. The decision was in the air. Everything came down to what would happen next. The warehouse floor pressed against Luis's face. The dust and cold of the stone stuck to his skin. The weight of his attacker still crushed his ribs. His breath was hot and bitter next to the doctor's ear. They fought there, body to body, like two cornered animals. The knife had flown away, but the man still had his knee on Luis's chest, trying to suffocate him. Luis felt that he was running out of air, that his strength was slowly fading. Then, a few inches from his hand, something glinted on the floor. It was a scalpel that had fallen from his pocket during the fall. It was small and cold, with a thin handle reflecting the flickering light of the candles. The metal looked so light, and yet capable of anything. Luis's fingers stretched out instinctively. He touched the handle, felt the cold, and grabbed it. All he needed was one short, precise movement, one quick cut, and it could all be over. His mind worked in a second. Do it now. Save everyone. The image of the immediate and raw danger ignited his rage. But at that very moment, something else crossed Luis's mind like a knife of memory. The face of Anna, the daughter he had lost. The news that came too late. The responsibility he had carried since then, day after day, like a weight on his chest. The memory was hard real. The failure that haunted him, the scalpel in his hand, became a burning memory of the past, like hot iron. He then looked at Lucia's belly, lying a few meters away. Two fragile hidden heartbeats fighting for a little air, waiting for a future that did not yet exist. He thought about what that blade would do if he used it to punish. He would be repeating a shadow that had already hurt him too much. The rage could devour him, turn him into the same violence he had promised to fight. His hands trembled, his fist clenched the scalpel. His whole body demanded action. They wanted to crush the fear with force. But deep down, something bigger spoke louder. The memory of his daughter, the weight of guilt, the silent promise he carried. Slowly, his body trembling, Luis let go of the scalpel. The metal fell with a dull thud against the cement, a short sound that seemed to echo throughout the warehouse. The attacker opened his eyes in surprise, not understanding the decision he had just seen. At that moment, Valeria reacted with precision in a quick, sharp movement. She struck the man's arm, twisted it, and in a few seconds he was face down on the floor, his wrists immobilized, unable to move. "It's over," said Valeria, her voice hard and tired, wet with everything they had been through. The phrase was an ending and a beginning at the same time. Luis remained on his knees, panting, his breathing slowly returning as if he were relearning how to live. His eyes were full of tears, sweat and dirt streaking his face. He looked at the scalpel on the floor, looked at Lucia, looked at the gray sky coming in through the cracks in the warehouse. Everything hurt, and at the same time calmed him. This time he didn't cut. This time he chose to protect. The decision left a strange feeling of relief mixed with pain, as if something in his chest had opened up to breathe. Luis understood there, in the middle of the dust and dirt, that this decision was the cure he had been looking for since Anna's loss. To save, not to hurt. To protect, not to punish. That became the clear line he needed to follow from now on. The wheels of the stretcher squeaked down the hospital corridor as it was pushed hurriedly. The noise mixed with Lucia's faint cry as she could no longer contain the pain. Her body arched in waves, her sweaty hands clutching the sheet. "The contractions have started," Valeria shouted, trying to make her way through the stopped stretchers, but the emergency room was almost empty. 2 nurses were asleep leaning against a wall. No doctor was on duty, only silence, the smell of alcohol, and the cold lights flickering. Luis stopped the stretcher suddenly. His heart raced. There was no time to look for anyone. It was there, in that forgotten corner of the hospital, where life was going to decide to be born. "Here," he murmured, swallowing hard. "Right here." Doña Remedio took off her sweater and folded it, placing it under Lucia's head. She sat down next to her, took her hand tightly, and murmured a prayer that seemed to lull her between pain and quiet hope. "Calm down, my daughter. Calm down. God is with you on the other side." Valeria, still with her serious police face, put her gun aside and offered her hand. Lucia grabbed it as if it were her anchor in the middle of the storm. Valeria said nothing, but the grip of her fingers was firm and sure. Luis opened the case. His hands trembled as he touched the instruments. The scalpel glinted coldly. He held it for a second and remembered the icy room, the steel table, the moment when he had almost opened Lucia's body, believing she was dead. Now it was different. Now the blade did not mean the end. It meant care. He took a deep breath, wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, and spoke in a low, firm voice close to her ear. "Calm down. I'm here. I'm not going to hurt you." Lucia cried, her eyes red from the effort, but she managed to whisper, "I'm scared." Luis took her hand too, closing the circle. "Me too, but let's do this together." The contractions came stronger. Lucia screamed. The sound echoed through the empty hallway. Remedio sang softly between prayers. Valeria encouraged her silently, squeezing her hand as if to say, "You're not alone." Luis guided each breath, each push, his eyes fixed on her belly. Sweat ran down his face, but he didn't move. Once again, "Lucia, breathe with me," said the broken but firm voice. The makeshift room had nothing but peeling walls, but inside there was something greater. The scalpel was now an ally. The hands that once carried guilt now only wanted to save. And amid the chaos on that cold early morning in Guadalajara, life began to announce itself. The restrained cries of all those present mingled with Lucia's efforts. Between the pain and the tears, she was no longer alone. The hallway seemed to hold its breath along with everyone else. The cold light flickered. The cart with empty sheets bumped softly against the wall with each of Lucia's contractions. Sweat ran down her forehead, her hair stuck to her skin, her eyes squeezed shut in pain. Luis leaned close to her ear, guiding her breathing firmly. "Breathe with me. Breathe in, breathe out. Very good, Lucia." Once again, Doña Remedio was on her left side, the rosary between her fingers, her wrinkled hand holding Lucia's head, repeating a simple prayer, almost like a quiet song. "My daughters, we are here. God is holding you on the other side." Valeria handed the gun to a stunned nurse who had just woken up and grabbed Lucia's hand tightly. Her face was still serious, but her eyes were full of tears. "You can do it, Lucia. Let's do this together." She squeezed my hand. If that hurts, the pain came like a high wave. Lucia screamed, and the sound echoed throughout the empty hallway. Luis checked, took a deep breath with her, and said, "Now push with all your might." Time stretched out for a second, then turned into 5. The air grew hot. Everyone seemed to fit into Lucia's breath, and then a warm stream passed, and a small weight slid into Luis's hands. a slippery little body trembling with cold and fear. For a moment, silence. "Come on, my love," Luis whispered with a broken voice. "Be here. Breathe." The cry came loud and round and full, filling the hallway as if a window had opened in room 4. Luis laughed and cried at the same time. Doña Remedio exclaimed, "Oh, thank you," which sounded like a hug. Valeria put her hand to her mouth, surprised by her own emotion. Luis wrapped the baby in Remedio's sweater and a warm sheet, placing her on Lucia's chest. Her little fingers opened and closed, searching for skin. Lucia cried and laughed at the same time. My baby, my baby. Sweat glistened on her face, but her smile was like sunshine. She brought her nose close to the little one's wet hair and breathed deeply, taking in that new smell that only those who have just arrived in the world have. 2 tears ran down each side of her face. "Her name will be Anna," she said between sobs, her voice broken but firm. The name Anna entered Luis like a gentle wind opening a window that had been closed for years. His mouth trembled. He couldn't hold back. He cried with sobs like a child who finds his mother after getting lost. The image of his daughter returned whole to his chest. It no longer hurt as it had before. It hurt and healed at the same time. Valeria tried to hide it, but she couldn't. The tears fell. She laughed and cried. She wiped her face with her sleeve. "Welcome," she said softly, like someone promising to take care of Doña Remedio. She leaned in with the care of someone touching the light. The baby's forehead, and then Lucia's. Then she came back and kissed them again, as if her heart could not fit in her body. Thank you," she repeated with her voice breaking. "May God keep you safe." Lucia looked at everyone without stopping smiling, and Luis adjusted the sheets, protecting the little head with his big hands, as if caring for a fragile little bird in the palm of his hand. The hallway, once so cold, became warm. The hospital, once so empty, felt full. And there, between peeling walls, without flowers, without music, without anything, there was a cry, a light, a mother laughing and letting go, a doctor crying with sobs, a policewoman who became a refuge, a simple woman who blessed 3 times, new life, a family reunited, and a beautiful silence that came afterwards, just to hear the sound of 3 hearts beating together. The early morning was almost completely silent, only the distant sound of a car passing in the street and the crackling of a candle consuming its own wax. The hospital chapel was empty, cold, but at the same time seemed to give a hug. Luis entered slowly, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. In his still trembling hands, he held Lucia's worn rosary. He looked at it for a while, as if looking at an old mirror, then approached the simple altar, placed the rosary at the base of the lit candle, and whispered with a broken voice, thank you for bringing me back." His eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not only tears of pain, they were tears of relief and gratitude. The camera would move away from there, gently shifting to another place. Lucia sleeps in a simple hospital bed, tired but smiling in her sleep. Beside her, Esperanza is finally at peace, her little braids scattered on the pillow between them. Little Anna breathes slowly, curled up in a silence full of promise. In room 4, 3 hearts are united as if the whole world were just that room, and the question remains in the air like an echo that cannot be silenced. When was the last time you chose to protect instead of hurt? Now I want to read your comments below. If you were Dr. Luis Valeria, or even Doña Remedio, what would you have done? Your answer may inspire someone who is reading, and don't forget to activate the bell so you don't miss the next stories. We have videos that have already made many people cry and rethink their lives. Another very emotional video is already appearing on the screen, talking about the voice that saved a life without saying a word. Click now and watch it, because I assure you, it will touch your heart. To find out who stayed with me until the end of this story, write in the comments. I would choose to protect them. I will read them one by one.